In November of 1919, during the Russian Civil War, the more powerful Red Army approached the opposing White Army's last stronghold in the city of Omsk. This then forced them to flee into the Siberian Wilderness on foot during the winter. What they would go on to endure afterward would be one of the most prolonged and grueling ordeals in Russian history. This is the horrifying story of the Siberian Ice March, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Most countries on Earth have rich and complicated histories. Often, though, for a variety of reasons, these histories don't extend far beyond their own borders. As you travel outward to surrounding countries, that history becomes less and less familiar, and by the time you're on the opposite side of the world, it's just an unfamiliar name on a map. There are, of course, exceptions to this. For one reason or another, either due to size, influence, or power, some countries' histories are far more well-known to the rest of the world. It's safe to say that countries like the United States, China, and Russia are disproportionately well-known globally. In Russia's case, this is likely due to its central role in both world wars, the Cold War, and even more recent events, along with its continent-spanning size. And much of this storied history can be traced back to its tumultuous start of the 20th century. The Russian Civil War broke out after the old imperial government collapsed in 1917, and right away, competing groups rushed in to fill the void. First, the Tsar was overthrown, and then the temporary government that replaced him was also overthrown by the Bolsheviks. And this, more than anything, set the stage for the next century of Russian history. For those unaware, the Bolsheviks were a revolutionary party that promised sweeping social and economic change and would go on to establish communist rule in Russia. And their takeover tipped the balance of the already weakened country and threw it into total chaos. In response to the takeover, a wide range of political opponents joined together loosely as something known as the White Army. They hoped to push the Bolsheviks back out of power and shape a new Russia themselves. Foreign governments, which were worried about Bolshevik ideas spreading beyond Russia, also offered support to the White Army, but even despite this, the Bolshevik Red Army gradually gained the advantage. It would go on to reclaim major cities and slowly pushed anti-Bolshevik forces farther east. As 1919 drew to a close, Russia existed more as a collection of battlefronts than a unified country, and the Reds were winning ground across the west and south while steadily shifting attention eastward. Meanwhile, the White Army in Siberia watched its territory shrink month by month, knowing the pressure would soon reach them in full force. At the time, the White Army Admiral Alexander Kolchak had made Siberia the center of his government, and the city of Omsk served at its core. For those just listening, Omsk is a little less than halfway across the country, just north of the border with Kazakhstan. And the city housed its administration, military headquarters, supply stores, and the enormous gold reserve that funded the entire operation. Basically everything ran through Omsk, and everyone involved understood the consequences of losing it. With that said though, Alexander's army along the Tobol and Ishim rivers had been pushed back again and again, and the Red Army was getting closer. Each retreat chipped away at the White Army, and by November, the front around Omsk was severely weakened. As a result, inside the city, the atmosphere was strained, and no one could quite agree on what should happen next. Alexander was determined to hold the city, believing its loss would collapse whatever was left of his authority. Some of his commanders, meanwhile, disagreed and tried to persuade him to pull back while there was still time to organize a proper retreat, but those discussions never made it very far. Every day brought new reports from the front that were mostly bad, and the sense that events were slipping out of the White Army's control became harder to ignore. As this was going on, another problem was growing in the background. The Czechoslovak Legion was a force of Czech and Slovak soldiers who fought alongside Russia in the First World War. When Russia withdrew from the war, the Legion was left stranded thousands of miles from home. The most direct route back was west, but that meant traveling straight into Red-controlled territory where they feared being disarmed or trapped. So instead, the Legion stayed together and began controlling their own fortified trains, depots, and key stations along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Instead of going west, their new goal was to move east all the way to the Pacific and escape Russia by sea. But their control of the railway had consequences. As the White Army retreated east, it found itself dependent on a rail line partially controlled by the Legion. And Legion trains and depots were heavily armed and fortified, and access to the railway often had to be negotiated. Then, as the Red advance accelerated, the Legion increasingly prioritized its own evacuation, tightening control over rail movement and further slowing the White retreat. Then beyond the Legion, the physical conditions also added another layer of difficulty. Heavy rains had caused a river to overflow and flood parts of the city, turning streets into literal waterways and making the movement of supplies and troops even more complicated. When the weather shifted and the river froze, it cleared a path for retreat that was by then inevitable. As the Red Army got closer, White Army government offices began to empty out. Officials packed documents while the military staff tried to escape on the crowded rail line. Civilians with the means to leave slipped away while they still could. The White Army itself, though, struggled with discipline as reports of officers drinking and refusing to take positions grew more common. All of this is to say that whatever defensive plans for Omsk had existed on paper never formed into anything beyond that. When the Red Army reached the outskirts of Omsk, the city no longer had the ability to fight. Alexander then sent the gold east and left the city shortly afterward. The remaining troops retreated out in scattered groups, desperate to escape before the last routes closed. On November 14, 1919, Red forces entered the city without even a significant battle. They recovered weapons, trains, equipment, and thousands of men who hadn't managed to flee in time. For the White Army who had escaped, though, the fall of Omsk marked the beginning of a much larger ordeal. There was no time to regroup, and there was little breathing room between them and the still advancing Red Army. There was also no reliable way to move such a large mass of soldiers and civilians across Siberia, and so the retreat that followed would stretch over more than 1,000 miles in brutal winter conditions. Once the city fell, everything that had been holding Alexander's eastern forces together began to give way, and hundreds of thousands of troops and civilians began to flee. The retreat wasn't orderly or coordinated either. The only clear direction was east, and even that path turned out to be far from simple. Again, the Trans-Siberian Railway should have been the White Army's greatest asset, but by November of 1919, it had become a massive bottleneck. Every available supply car, passenger coach, freight wagon, and improvised hospital train was already filled. Government ministries were evacuating their archives, and officials were fleeing with their families. Military officers traveled with whatever belongings they could carry, and entire wagon loads of equipment were being sent eastward without any central coordination. And add to that the enormous number of civilians who didn't want to remain under Bolshevik rule, and the result was a traffic jam stretching for hundreds of miles. And conditions away from the tracks were no better. As troops marched parallel to the railway, winter settled in for good. Temperatures plummeted, and the landscape was quickly covered in deep snow. Villages were few and far between, offering little food or shelter. Hunger also became a constant problem, and the cold claimed as many lives as diseases and gunfire. Typhus also spread rapidly through both troops and civilians alike, and entire trains full of sick men were left behind because they were too contagious or too weak to move. Some cars apparently even froze shut, trapping those alive still inside. At smaller stations, makeshift hospitals were set up, but they became more like holding pens for the dying rather than places of recovery. Meanwhile, to make things worse, Bolshevik supporter groups took advantage of the chaos. They attacked isolated White Army detachments, seizing equipment and disrupting rail lines whenever possible. In some regions, uprisings broke out inside towns the White Army was trying to pass through, which only added to the uncertainty of every mile they had to travel. Commanders didn't know whether the next station would greet them with friendly locals, hostile rebels, or a Red Army detachment. By December, several White Armies attempted to retreat along different routes had nearly lost contact with one another. Some groups followed the railway while others pushed south into the Siberian grasslands. Some of the troops became scattered or absorbed into whatever unit they could find. Alexander's government, meanwhile, which was separated from the bulk of the army, effectively stopped functioning. Orders issued from trains rarely reached the front, and messages from the front rarely reached anyone with the authority to act on them. And through all of this, the Red Army kept advancing. They moved faster than the White Army could reorganize, taking town after town as they went. Every time the White Army paused to rest, the Reds closed the distance. Amid all of this chaos, a White Army general named Vladimir Kappel became a source of stability. His reputation among the troops was strong. Men who had lost faith in most of the White leadership still trusted him because he shared the same hardships they did. By the time he was appointed to take control of the retreating forces, though, discipline was non-existent. Entire units were drifting away from the front in search of food or shelter. Supply lines no longer existed either, and communication was spotty. There was just no realistic way to coordinate the thousands of splintered parts of the White Army. So as a result of this, Vladimir issued an order that anyone unwilling to continue the march was free to leave. He didn't want to keep men who no longer saw a point in fighting. What he wanted were the soldiers who chose to stay despite everything collapsing around them. The men who remained formed the core of what would become known as Kappell's army. It didn't have troops in large numbers, but those who were part of it were committed. They had willingly accepted that the road ahead would be long and brutal. For many of them, Vladimir's leadership was the only thing that still gave their retreat some sense of direction and structure. Still, even with Vladimir at the front, the situation was grim. Again, communication within the White Army was unreliable at best. No one knew exactly where they were or how many men were left. The Legion continued to control long stretches of the railway and often blocked access to vital trains, which left large groups of soldiers stranded. Ammunition was also running low and food was inconsistently provided, and in the middle of all this, winter temperatures were dropping by the day. Despite the worsening conditions, Vladimir managed to hold his force together for a time. He set a pace for the retreat and established a sense of order. He reminded the men that they still had a destination to reach, even if the details of what that destination actually was or how they would get there remained unclear. His leadership didn't solve the larger problems facing the White Army, but it prevented the march from breaking up entirely at a time when collapse seemed almost inevitable. And so, the army continued east under Vladimir, but every mile they covered under his command brought them closer to the darkest and most grueling parts of the retreat. As they marched east, the landscape turned into heavily forested areas of deep snow. The Shevgloskoye Taiga was seemingly endless miles of dense trees, few paths, and snowdrifts that came up to the men's waists. There were even fewer settlements along the way, and the small villages that did exist couldn't support the waves of exhausted soldiers passing through them. Vladimir also knew that the army couldn't linger anywhere near the railway, where the approaching Red Army would certainly find them. The only option was to push the men through the forest and hope they could stay intact long enough to reach open ground on the other side. He was honest about what was coming too. Before entering the Taiga, he issued another order that allowed anyone who didn't want to continue to turn back or surrender to the Red Army. And so only those determined to stick with the march followed him into the woods. For that group, the conditions hit them immediately. The snow was so deep in places that wagons stalled and horses struggled to move. Men soon found themselves slowed to a crawl. Many of the heavy weapons were abandoned early in the crossing simply because there was no practical way to haul them forward. Food had already become scarce before reaching the forest, but inside the taiga there was next to nothing to eat. Sleep was also hard to come by and irregular at the best of times. The march itself was also tested as the column of men stretched out in ways no one could really control. Units that were supposed to march together lost sight of each other within hours, and those who fell behind rarely caught back up. Wounded men who could no longer walk were left in small groups with whatever shelter could be improvised, although everyone understood what their chances were. Even healthy soldiers found themselves battling frostbite and disorientation, and arguments over the correct direction became common. About the only part of the army that remained organized was the rear guard. Several divisions took turns holding off Red Army patrols, pushing into the edge of the forest. They burned sleds and supplies while trying to buy the main column enough time to stay ahead of the Red pursuit. When historians later described the retreat, they often pointed out that entire units never emerged again on the far side of the Taiga. Others did, but only as thin and weakened remnants of what they were before. By the time the Red Army reached the eastern edge of the forest, most of the soldiers who remained were physically and mentally worn down, but there was still no time to pause. The Red Army was still close, and the retreat had to continue, and incredibly, the worst was still yet to come. When the army finally cleared the Taiga, many of the men believed and hoped that the worst was behind them. A city named Krasnoyarsk sat ahead on the Yenisei River. This was a major city with warehouses, rail access, food, shelter, medical supplies, and a chance to reorganize. After weeks of moving through the frozen wilderness, the idea of reaching a functioning city seemed almost unreal. Soldiers talked about spending a night indoors or finding enough provisions to make the next leg of the march more manageable, but those hopes didn't last long. Before Vladimir's forces even approached the outskirts, unrest broke out inside the city. Local Bolshevik supporters, factory workers, and a portion of the city's troops rose up and seized control, effectively closing off the city. In their weakened state, the White Army couldn't hope to fight their way through the resistance. So, with no reinforcements coming and the Red Army closing in behind them, Vladimir decided to bypass it altogether. This was just another blow to the army's morale, and the detour that was chosen was taxing. The terrain north of the city was rough and filled with more of the same deep snow they had just left. Units that had been barely holding it together during the Taiga crossing were now pushed past their limits. Many of the men simply surrendered when they realized the city wasn't going to be taken, and others simply stopped marching. Typhus, meanwhile, continued to spread, and the column lost even more strength as sick and frostbitten soldiers fell behind. Those who did manage to fight their way around Krasnoyarsk were once again no longer the same force that had left Omsk. Units arrived at checkpoints literally missing half their numbers. When the remnants of the various white armies finally linked up beyond the city, the combined force still looked large, but only a portion of the men were in any shape to fight. At this point, the retreating army also faced a new problem. They still had to find a way to reconnect with the Siberian Railway farther east, and the most direct routes were now blocked by uprisings or controlled by Red forces. That left Vladimir with few choices, and none of them were good. The option he settled on was another difficult detour following the Yenisei River northward before going east along the Khan River toward the next potential railway stop. It was a longer and far more physically demanding route, but it offered the possibility of avoiding another major confrontation. Once again, though, the terrain along the Khan River turned out to be as difficult as anything the army had faced so far. The snow again came up to the men's knees, and the riverbanks offered almost no shelter from the wind. There were long stretches without any civilization nearby, and the army only came across scattered hunting cabins that could only hold a handful of people at best. Fires were difficult to maintain in the open, and many men walked for days with barely any rest. As the column made its way through this narrow, winding route, more soldiers succumbed to frostbite. Some apparently even froze to death while still on their feet. Also, to really put this march into context, by this point the men had traveled 1,500 kilometers since Omsk. It was during this crossing that Vladimir suffered an injury that would ultimately cost him his life. One day, while moving along the river, he stepped onto a patch of ice that gave way beneath him. He plunged into the freezing Khan River, and although he managed to pull himself out quickly, the damage was immediate and extensive. His feet became severely frostbitten, and the ensuing infection was even worse. He continued issuing orders and directing the march from a sled as his condition worsened with every day of travel. Men who were barely standing themselves were inspired by the fact that he was still leading them, but the reality was that they were now moving forward with a dying commander. To make things worse, much like the situation in Krasnoyarsk, by the time the army approached the outskirts of the next railway stop, they learned the city had fallen into the hands of Bolshevik supporters. The troops had switched sides, and the White Army no longer had a clear path through the town. So once again, they had to veer away and navigate another difficult detour. Vladimir held on long enough to gather his officers for a final meeting near the next rail stop. Even then, he tried to steer the army's next steps and insisted that they aim for the city of Irkutsk. He wouldn't live long enough to see it happen, though, as he passed away on January 26, 1920, just one day after handing over command to General Sergei Wojciechowski. As a sign of respect, the men carried Vladimir's body with them as they continued the retreat. The plan had been to reach Irkutsk quickly, regroup, and then attempt to free Alexander, who had been captured and was believed to be held somewhere in the city. Before they even reached it, though, it became clear that Irkutsk had changed dramatically. As had become the trend by then, the city was no longer under control of forces friendly to the White Army. Local socialist revolutionary leaders had taken power, and soon after, the Bolsheviks began asserting control as well. So once again, whatever hope the White Army had of receiving help inside the city vanished. Red Army troops then moved out from the city to block the approaching White Army column. The first major clash came near the station at Zima, where Sergei's men managed to push through after a fierce fight, but the cost was high. A count taken after the battle showed how depleted they were. Out of the tens of thousands who had started the retreat weeks earlier, only a small fraction were still fit enough to take part in these battles. Many more were sick, frostbitten, or simply too emaciated to fight. Even if the White Army had been stronger, though, another obstacle stood in the way. Units of the Czechoslovak Legion, which were still guarding the rear line, declared the area around Irkutsk a neutral zone. They warned the White Army not to enter because any attempt to assault the city would put their own evacuation in jeopardy. As this was all going on, events inside Irkutsk were happening fast. Alexander was formally handed over to the Bolsheviks, and word of his fate traveled through the retreating troops. On February 7th, 1920, before the White Army could even consider an attempt to reach him, Alexander was executed by firing squad. This meant that a mission to save him was over before they were even within sight of the city. So with Alexander dead and the White Army too weak to challenge the city, Sergei made the only decision he could. He abandoned any plans of an assault and continued on with the retreat. Instead of heading into Irkutsk, the White Army bypassed it and headed to the eastern shores of Lake Baikal. As bad as things were, the only way forward at this point required crossing the frozen expanse of the largest lake by volume on Earth. This was a route that promised its own kind of danger, as the Siberian winter was now entering its coldest stretch. And other than being enormous, Lake Baikal is known for brutal winter conditions, but there was just no other realistic route left. Red forces blocked the land approaches, and the local uprisings had shut off nearby towns. The only open path was straight across the ice. Guides from the region unsurprisingly warned against it. They knew the lake's surface could shift and crack without warning. The wind could sweep across the lake with such force that men and horses would be knocked over. Sergei gave the order, and in mid-February of 1920, White Army units stepped off the shoreline and onto the frozen lake. It was roughly 31 miles or 50 kilometers across and too far to see the other side. The ice was solid in most places, but slick enough that travel was difficult. Horses struggled for footing, and many collapsed or broke legs when they fell. This meant that whatever artillery or wagons had survived the march so far were being dragged across the lake by hand. To make matters worse, with no shelter anywhere on the ice, wind became the greatest threat. Gusts swept up snow that blinded the men, and temperatures were so low that exposed skin went numb within minutes. By the time the last rear unit stepped onto the far shore near Mysovaya station, somewhere between 30,000 and 35,000 people had crossed Lake Baikal. Unfortunately, just like the previous cities the White Army encountered, hopes that the town would offer any relief faded almost immediately. At Mysovaya station, soldiers expected to find trains ready to move the sick, frostbitten, and families who'd been trailing the army since Omsk. Instead, once again, there were no reliable trains waiting to carry the entire army east. So next, the most vulnerable groups, which included women, children, and badly wounded soldiers, were placed in whatever rail cars could be found. The hope was that they would reach the city of Chita without much resistance, which was still held by anti-Bolshevik forces. The healthier soldiers then stayed on foot and turned north into more remote ground to avoid the potential of ambushes at choke points. This northern detour proved to be another bitter stretch, but finally, by early March of 1920, the first battered columns of the White Army approached Chita. They arrived in scattered groups that filtered into the city over time. Many of the men who staggered in had not slept indoors for months. Their uniforms were torn and boots were worn through. Frostbite had left scars on their faces and hands, and they looked as though they had been through something that was indescribable. Officers tried to take headcounts, but the numbers shifted constantly as more groups trickled in. Depending on the source, somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 soldiers from the old Eastern Front reached Chita, but that figure didn't fully capture what the army had once been or what it had endured to that point. Columns that had started in Omsk with thousands sometimes arrived in Chita with only a few hundred men. Families who had begun the march together often reached Chita without the loved ones they left Omsk with. Even the units that were considered combat ready were a shell of their former selves. But even despite all of this, the sight of the city brought a sense of relief that the army hadn't felt since before Omsk fell. The retreat stretched through forests, frozen rivers, taiga, mountains, and a vast lake, so simply arriving meant surviving something few had imagined they could endure. As more and more troops made it, efforts were undertaken to begin reorganizing what remained. Smaller units were dissolved and folded into others, and divisions that had been reduced to a few hundred men were rebuilt as combined regiments. The goal was to create a functional force again, and throughout the spring and summer of 1920, these rebuilt units helped defend Chita and the surrounding region with the support of Japanese troops. They would manage to hold the positions longer than many expected, given the state of the army, but the wider conflict was still progressing. The Red Army continued advancing across Russia, and the political situation in Siberia grew increasingly fragile. By then, nothing could stop the Red advance, and the remaining pockets of resistance either fled east and out of the country, were destroyed, or were simply captured and imprisoned. The entire harrowing journey totaled around 1,200 miles, or 2,000 kilometers. And while historians don't agree on a single death toll for the march, the best available estimates suggest the human cost was extremely high, likely reaching into the tens of thousands. If you made it this far, I hope you enjoyed the video. I also want to give a special thanks to all the channel members and supporters on Patreon. I can't thank you all enough for your support. If you're interested, we have early access videos released usually a week in advance of the regular uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, I'd love to hear it, and you could submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.